Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. My only regret is that I do not speak Spanish. I'm sorry, and I thank you all for listening to me in English. What I have to say is very, very simple. That basically, the bigger your income differences in a society, the greater the range and the more common a whole range of health and social problems are. More unequal societies, bigger income gaps between rich and poor, have more violence, worse health, worse standards of child well-being, teenage births, obesity, a whole range of problems. And I'm going to be showing you that and then trying to give you a suggestion of what is going on underneath the surface, behind the data. But the people speaking after me, I think, will often give you a clearer idea, because my co-author and I, Kate Pickett, who is sitting there, believe that most of the explanations of our sensitivity to inequality and social hierarchy come from our evolved psychology. I'm going to be talking about the rich developed countries, but the effects of inequality are apparent all the way across the distribution. This graph, you see, is GNP per capita along the bottom. So it's the whole long course of economic growth from the poorest countries, the less developed countries, to the richest countries. And you see there, in the early stages of economic growth, infant mortality rates come tumbling down. The blue line shows the infant mortality rates for the most unequal society, with the biggest income differences between rich and poor. The bottom green line shows that throughout the course of economic development, more equal societies have lower infant mortality rates. And that is true of many different problems. You could also look at it in relation to life expectancy. With infant mortality, the lower the better. With life expectancy, the higher the better. And so we could have three lines here showing life expectancy in unequal countries and life expectancy in the most equal countries. But I'm showing you this because it makes it very clear how rapidly health improves in the early stages of economic growth. And then it flattens out. And amongst the rich, developed societies at the top right, there is no longer any relationship between economic growth and GNP per capita. Even when you look at changes over 20 or 40 years, there's no relationship. However, if we look just at the rich developed countries, this is the same data. So here they are without that long tail of poorer countries. You can see so clearly that it really doesn't matter whether you're as rich as Norway and Sweden, as Norway and USA on the right, or half as rich like Israel and Greece and Portugal on the left. It makes no difference. But there's a paradox here. Although income doesn't matter between the rich developed societies, if you look within any of the developed societies, this is data from England and Wales. This is from small areas, local neighborhoods. And you see the poorest on the right have short life expectancy, and the richest on the left have long life expectancy. And that is not just a difference between the poor and everyone else, it's a gradient right across society. To understand health inequalities, it's no good just thinking about the homeless or the unemployed. You also have to have an explanation why the people just below the top, not quite the richest, do less well than the richest. The explanation of why income does not matter between these countries, but matters within them, is because within these countries we're looking at the effects of relative income, how your income compares with others in your own society, the effects of social status, social position. It's about relationships. And as soon as you've got that idea, that it's about superiority and inferiority, you then have to start thinking, what happens if we make the income differences between us bigger or smaller? And that's what I'm going to show you today. The data we use come from the UN Human Development Report, and because it's an easy measure that we could just download that everyone understands, we used how much richer the more equal societies, the rich are getting 3.5 or 4 times as much as the poorest 20%. But on the right-hand side, in the UK, In Portugal, in the USA, in Singapore, the gap is twice as big. They're getting 7, 8, or 9 times as much as the poorest 20%. We collected data on a whole range of health and social problems. International data on life expectancy for each country, on maths and literacy scores, on infant mortality rates in each country, how high homicide rates are, what proportion of the population are in prison, teenage birth rates, levels of trust, how much people feel they can trust others, obesity rates, some figures on mental illness, which also include drug addiction, and figures on social mobility. And we put them in one index. They're all weighted equally, so where a country is a reflection of its sort of average performance on these things. And you see on the right, the United States, Portugal, UK, the more unequal societies have more of all these problems. And on the left, the more equal countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Japan, have fewer of all those problems. What these problems have in common is that they are all problems with these social gradients. I showed you those blue bars of life expectancy in England and Wales, showing that there's a gradient in health right across society. There is a gradient in violence. There is a gradient in educational performance. There is a gradient in obesity. All these problems worse at the bottom of society. It's those kind of problems which are made worse by greater inequality. The only surprise is that these problems, as inequality increases, they don't just get worse amongst the poor. They get worse amongst all of us. So even if we forget about the poor, if we lived in a more equal society, we might live a bit longer, our children might do a bit better at school, we'd be less likely to become victims of violence, and our children would be less likely to become teenage parents or get involved in drugs. In that sense, we would all do better in a more equal society. We looked at this index in relation to GNP per capita. You see, there's no relationship there. As I said, this is not, in the rich countries, about absolute levels of living. It's about differences between us. We also looked at the United Nations Index of Child Well-being. It's not related to GNP per capita. Countries twice as rich as others do just as well. No pattern at all here. But when you look at that same index of child well-being in relation to inequality, in more unequal societies, they have lower levels of child well-being. We also looked at change over time, over a 10-year period, and in this measure of child well-being, as societies increased inequality or a few decreased their inequality, you can see at least a statistically significant relationship with child well-being. These inequalities affect social relations, they affect mental illness. This is the proportion of the population who have had any mental illness in the last year, and it's at the bottom there, it's about 8%, but it rises to 25% in the more unequal countries, mainly anxiety and depression and things like that. This is a measure of how much people feel they can trust others. It's a general measure of trust. It's the proportion of the population who agree that most people can be trusted. It's often used in surveys of social cohesion. It comes from the World Values Survey. Here is a very similar measure in the American states. And again, you see the more unequal states with the bigger income differences, people trust each other less. In Chile, you have amongst the lowest levels of trust. I don't know whether you can read that, but Chile has, it's 13% of the population feel they can trust others. At the bottom you have Portugal, Mexico, Turkey, and Chile. At the top you have the most equal countries, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden. The biggest income differences between rich and poor in South Africa, then Brazil, then Chile. And the most equal countries, Sweden and Denmark, at the bottom. So again, this relationship between how big the income differences are and how much people feel they can trust others. This also feeds into violence. There are many papers in the peer-reviewed journals showing that the bigger the income differences, the bigger the differences in homicide. And so at the top, you have about 150 homicides per million population. The red dots are American states. The blue triangles at the bottom are Canadian provinces. But at the bottom, it's about 15 homicides per million. So it goes from 15 to 150, 10 times as much. And it's quite a close relationship with inequality. This is the same relationship, but a different group of countries. I'm showing you this because it has Chile in it. You can see just below the top, below the line at the right-hand end is Chile. High levels of inequality, high levels of homicide. These relationships are not just in violence and trust, but there are papers showing that people are less willing to help each other in more unequal societies. Surveys find that people are less willing to help neighbors. They're less willing to help old people or the disabled if they live in more unequal societies. You lose social cohesion, you lose trust, you gain violence. And you can see that. We were recently in Mexico, and you see how people are having to defend themselves from others in their society. In more equal societies, you don't see any of these bars and gates and razor wire and so on. In Chile, here are electric fences in some houses. You move from cohesive societies to societies where people are afraid of each other, with the biggest income differences. This is South Africa, exactly the same story. You can see the electric wires on top, and that notice says armed response. So if you try and get in to that garden, you may be shot. I think what we're looking at are the effects of whether we have a very steep social pyramid like that, whether there are big material differences between us and big social distances between us. More feelings of superiority at the top and inferiority at the bottom. Whether we have those big, steep hierarchies or much shallower ones like that. So it's not something separate from class and status. It's about how material differences affect and make class, status and class more important. You've all always known that these problems are worst at the bottom of society. You've always recognized the effects of class. We also find that social mobility is slower in more unequal societies. This line shows that your father's income is more important as a determinant of how you do in your lifetime and your income in a more unequal society like Chile up there and Brazil, South Africa, than it is in the more equal societies. The data here is really asking the question, do rich fathers have rich sons and poor fathers have poor sons? Or doesn't father's income matter very much? And the answer is it matters very much in the most unequal societies, but it doesn't matter very much in the more equal ones. And of course, as the income differences get bigger, some people are so important at the top, and other people you look down on, they're worthless. Those are the prejudiced attitudes. And we all become more worried about how other people judge us, whether they think you're any good, what people think of you. And we see self-enhancement going up, we see narcissism going up. This is a graph from a paper in which people were interviewed in different countries and asked to compare themselves with what they guess was the average in their country. It's like asking you, do you think you're cleverer than other people in Chile? Do you think you're more attractive? Do you think you're better drivers? Do you think you're more generous? So they asked them to rate themselves on a number of things like that. And in the more unequal countries, people present themselves as better and more important than they really are. You also see the opposite effect, that if we're all very worried about how we're seen and judged, social contact becomes an ordeal. It's very stressful. You withdraw from social life. And of course, some people are overcome with low self-esteem, lack of confidence, and we see depression going up. And so you can respond to the worries, the increased status competition, either by self-promotion, self-enhancement, or by feeling inadequate and small. And you see both of these happening in the international data. And sure enough, in more unequal societies, everyone feels more status anxiety. These are different income groups. You see on the left, the poorest tenth of the population. On the right, the richest tenth of the population. And those different lines of status anxiety, the top line is showing the higher levels of status anxiety right across societies in the more unequal societies. The bottom line shows lower levels of status anxiety at all income levels in the more equal societies. If you want to follow this up, we have published a paper looking at the causality behind these relationships, these correlations, and our book sets out the data. It's been translated into Spanish, so you see the English and the Spanish there. Thank you very much.